I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and the associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am joined by Colin Walsh. You may not know his name yet, but you're definitely going to know it soon because his debut novel, Kala, is incredible. So, Colin, thank you so much for being here with us today.
No, thanks a million for having me on. I'm a big fan of the show, so if I start to levitate at any point during the discussion, it's just because I'm happy to be here. So ignore my legs as they kick past the screen. It's all completely normal. So yeah.
Exactly. We're very excited to have you here as well because this novel is truly something special. It is a thriller. It has all the beauty and craft of literary fiction. You will not be able to stop turning pages, but at the same time, you'll want to slow down because you don't want to miss any second of this beautiful writing. So I think this book is going to blow people away. But that being said, this is a bit of a thriller. It has Tana French moments, meet Emma Cline moments, meet sort of this dark teenage drama. I don't want to spoil anything because there are so many good twists and turns, but do you want to do a little plot synopsis for us to sort of set up the book?
Yeah, Callum follows a group of friends who we follow these friends as teenagers and as adults. So as teenagers, we're with them really over the course of like the summer of their lives. They're passing through all these adolescent thresholds, like the first love, the first kiss, the first time getting drunk. So all that kind of feverish, giddy, hormonal magic. And at the center of this group of friends is Kala. She's 15. She's the leader of the group. She's kind of their emotional core, their heartbeat, and the glue that's really keeping this whole group together. But the thing is that beneath every kind of smiling surface of their West Coast of Ireland tourist town, there's this simmering darkness that's constantly threatening to swallow the characters. And as that fateful summer goes on, they're getting closer and closer to the darkness. And by the end of that summer, Kala goes missing. And 15 years later, 3 of the surviving members of that original group of teenagers are thrown back together when human remains are found in the woods, and the past and the present begin to, dramatically and violently collide. So throughout the novel, you're following the characters. The past and the present are intertwined. You're following them as adults and as teenagers.
And there's so much more. Like, that just scratches the surface. Every time I think about this book, every time I talk about it, there's like more pieces that I always want to tell people, but I can't because it's like, wait, you just need to like experience that for yourself or come up to that realization about some of these characters that really creates this expansive world. There's a lot in this book. I've been so curious to know how you sort of started on this story. So this is your first novel. How did you sort of decide this is going to be the one to write and this is going to be the one you want to put out in the world?
Whenever you're deciding on a project, if it's a short story or an essay or whatever, there's always the thing that makes you kind of gravitate towards an idea is that you just feel this kind of throb or this pulse that's there within it. But you don't really know exactly what it is until you begin to work on it. And I had these kind of images in my head that ended up kind of being sort of guiding lights for the book. But it was only when I really began to write out things like scenes just with these characters that I just felt there's more and more and more to this. Initially there was a short story and it was like, no, this is bigger than a short story. But what's happening with that person over there? So I would write a bit on that. And then I began to just see that it kept expanding, but not just expanding, it kept kind of going deeper. The more layers that there were, the more I knew that like this was just a world that I wanted to be in all the time. It was something that I just became really obsessed with, the characters and the town that they live in. There wasn't a moment where I consciously was like, of all the ideas I have, that is the one that I will go for. It was really that the book was my whole horizon, if you know what I mean.
Sometimes the book, it just comes out when you need to write something, you need to write something.
Yeah.
With these characters, I can imagine that once you sort of start looking through those eyes and sort of getting to know those characters as people, how do you stop writing? I mean, you've created some really intriguing characters that have a lot of depth and a lot of warmth, and they feel very real. So I can imagine that it was very easy to sort of live in that world. So this book is told through the perspectives of multiple characters. Each chapter sort of bounces back and forth between some of our core group of characters. Was there one that sort of came to you first, a first voice that stuck out the most, that sort of let you in, or did they all sort of percolate at the same time?
I think that Helen was actually the first voice that kind of was there. So there are three narrators. There's Helen, Joe, and Mush, and Helen was the one who came first. But it's quite, yeah, it was interesting because you were saying just there about getting to know characters and things like that. And with Helen, for example, she was quite vivid to me quite quickly. She came very early. I knew that Helen had this sort of vulnerability to her. Her heart is almost like this ferocious tremor or trembling that's within her. And I knew that was there, and I knew the reasons that was there. But she constantly surprised me with just how abrasive she could be in protecting that space within her, or hiding it from other people and hiding it also from herself, particularly as an adult. She's almost suffocating in emotional armor by that point, by the time we find her as an adult. So Helen was the one who was there first, but she did surprise me the minute that, I began to write her at any length, the way that she would almost deflect you, I felt that as the writer of, you could feel that there was this constant tension within her, that she was just kind of like a pillar of fire that she was carrying inside her. Then she had to keep everything super controlled and tight in order to not get hurt by the intensity of her own feeling,
And it's very interesting the way that you write these different narrations. We have two, Helen and Mush, and they're written in first person, while the Joe section is written in the second person. And that is such an interesting, there are so few books, I think, that utilize that style, that second person voice at all. And then to combine it with these other pieces really lets you into the character's world in such a different way. You get to know the characters so much more intimately, but at the same time, because you have these conflicting voices, sometimes you aren't sure whose story you're really getting the most truth from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was something that was really important to me as an overall structural thing, because I guess I was thinking of, there's this famous essay that Talese wrote about Frank Sinatra in the 60s called Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. And it was basically the thing was that he was trying to get an interview with Sinatra, and Sinatra's entourage kept on rebuffing him and saying, no, Mr. Sinatra has a cold. And he would talk to Sinatra's bodyguard. He would talk to the person who looked after Sinatra's toupee. He would talk to fans at the hotel, all this sort of thing. And gradually he realized that all the different versions of Sinatra that he was getting from all these different people, that this kind of collage of voices was giving him a much more interesting portrait of Sinatra than any direct one-on-one interview would. And that became the substance of the piece. And that really was an influence on Calla, because what I wanted was for the reader to be very involved in creating their own idea of who these characters were by seeing the irreconcilabilities or the fissures of difference between how each of them would represent certain things or how each of them would perceive certain things. Like Helen will see Joe acting a certain way and think this thing about Joe, but as a reader, you're aware that there's probably something else going on inside Joe at that moment in time. And then, Mush, and you're constantly triangulating your perspective between the different characters. And that was a way of kind of pulling the reader in as well, because you're creating this sort of space for the reader to enter the book and actually become a participant in every interaction in terms of decoding what it actually means. So that was really important to me, just as a structural way of really inviting the reader in,
It shows how much that you really truly understand those characters, because you are writing from such a close place within them. If you look at something, third person, you can create some distance sort of between what the narration or what the author or voice might be saying about these characters, but you are constantly in the minds of these people and creating the structure from the inside out. So it allows such a more intimate portrayal, and I think works so well on a thriller mystery basis, because we're kept guessing just as much as they are. You don't have any information that they don't know in those moments.
For sure, yeah, that was a really important thing to me, and that was something that a lot of stories that I really like that have this sense of tension. The tension does come from that thing of you can't actually see beyond the parameters of what a first person narrator can see. So you're constantly aware that there is probably stuff going on at the edge of the frame that the narrator just isn't privy to. And obviously, as a writer, your task is to be layering that stuff in for the kind of very perceptive reader or whatever, you know. But at the end of the day, you can get a lot of tension just from the fact that you know that the character doesn't know what the character doesn't know, if you know what I mean.
Right.
So that was very important to me, was that there was no sort of sense of an omniscient narrator who's kind of let's cut away to here where you can see what the character doesn't know. It had to be very grounded in their subjectivity all the time.
I think especially when it comes to Joe, because he in many ways is sort of floundering and lost in a huge sense for so much of this book. He's really grappling with a lot of things, and we are invited to go along right with it. But because we're in that sort of different perspective with him, for me at least, right away, he was maybe the hardest to get within and to sort of go along with, because the other two have sort of a warmer sensibility right up front. You get to know them a little bit more, but as the book progresses, it really sort of opens up and you're able to put all those pieces together and start to really understand the characters in a bigger way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, with Joe's voice being in the second person, you know, there is this sort of almost an alienation that comes with that, just because it is just a jarring kind of thing to even as a reader, it's just a jarring thing to read. But, you know, when I first started writing Joe in the second person, it was immediately, you know, on a gut level, it was immediately clear that, like, this is it. Like, this is, I have him. This is Joe, you know. I have a lot of post facto reasoning for why that very intuitive gut decision worked. And I think most writers would say the same. Like, the most important decisions you make while writing are decisions that you either make them completely on your gut or you make them without even realizing you've made them, you know. I can see now that, you know, there are multiple reasons why the second person was an important way for me, even as the writer, to get closer to Joe's sense of himself, because Joe's relationship to himself is as an object. He doesn't really conceive or experience himself as a coherent subject. You know, he is someone he's constantly triangulating his idea of who he is through whoever it is that he's interacting with. My girlfriend is a therapist, and she read the book, and afterwards she said, like, that he was an almost classic case of what you would call in psychoanalytic terms, they'd call it like a hysterical personality structure, by which what that means in psychoanalysis basically is that you don't have a coherent sense of yourself. You're constantly reaching out and flailing towards the world for other people to tell you who you are. But there's no stability to be found in any definition that anyone gives you, because the minute someone says you are this, it's like, but am I? Why am I that? What makes me that? Have I earned the right to be that? Am I that? What do you think I am? And Joe is really caught in that. It's a totally unstable position to be in. And the ironic thing, of course, is that to any external eye, he looks like he's the king of the world, you know. And a lot of the reason that he's in this totally unstable psychological position is because that is the entire way that he's been conditioned since he was a kid, is to conceive of himself as a kind of master of the universe. But, you know, like, I think on some level, if you're going to be quite ungenerous with him, which I think is quite easy to do, because, you know, there's a darkness or a callousness that kind of comes with his self-involvement. If you were to be ungenerous with that, you would just kind of dismiss him as, oh, you know, this guy is just narcissistic, da 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 da. But, you know, I do have a real compassion for him, because even though within the symbolic order of the society that he's in, he is like a king, to be a king is still to be completely caught in the structure of your society and having to fulfill a role. And the role is not who you are. You know, he's so committed to the role that the person he is beneath that role is floundering, like, all the time. And as you said, you know, floundering is exactly the word. You know, it's a great word to use to describe his general mode throughout the book.
And like with any of the characters, the journey that we sort of go on with them, the understanding of what they've been through, and sort of as those layers are peeled back, it allows for so much more compassion and so much more understanding for even the characters like Joe, where at first glance you might think, oh, he's got it all figured out and he's fine and he's doing well. And then as things sort of move forward, you go, oh, okay, so here's all the reasons why all those things are completely not true. And so much of that is with the interactions that these characters have, not only just with their own group, but with this sort of wide cast of supporting characters that you've created that are in many ways these very interesting caricatures of people on the fringes of this missing persons case. There's everyone's family. Kala's grandmother is such a intriguing and striking image through this entire book. There's so much that sort of weaves in and out. How did it feel to sort of create this big net of people, because they all are sort of necessary in order to tell this story?
Yeah, how did it feel? It often felt like I had about 80 beehives in my skull or something. It was really it was really a lot of plates to kind of be spinning all the time, in the early stages at least, because it was only during the copywriting stage of the book when someone sent the copywriter, the copyright editor sent a cast of characters as part of their notes. So it was a cast of all of the characters in the thing. And I was like, oh my God. I was just reading it and I was like, why did I do this to myself?
It's a long list.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not one of these, it's not an insanely large cast of characters. Like I'm not, it's not like I'm not George R.R. Martin or anything like that, but at the same time, it is very expansive, and the way that I conceived of the characters, not just the main characters, but this larger cast, these people are not they're not self-contained, distinct individuals that move kind of in hermetically sealed from one another. Their entire way of being is always conditioned by their interactions with one another. Who they are as individuals is always being conditioned by that which is beyond their individuality. So whether that's their relationship to Kala or to one another or to their past or to their town or to their family or whatever, they're constantly in this kind of flux. So a lot of the time you're seeing characters, you might think of them as one way, but then if you see them in another context, there's this other dimension that comes out with them. Even the cruelest kind of characters, I wanted there to be this kind of grain of dimensionality there, that you could see that no one is reducible from the plurality of what it is to be a person. No one is reducible to just this one facet. So it was very important to me that I had this, that I honored all of these characters in their own way, but it was definitely a headache sometimes. I'm not going to lie.
There's a lot of interaction in this book, and you certainly do have some cruel characters, and I won't get too much into that because I think it sort of does lend itself towards giving things away, but there are definitely some people in this book that you will not like. But like you said, everyone feels dimensional. There aren't any characters that feel flat or that they're just on the page to serve that page's purpose and we'll never sort of revisit them again or understand how they fit in this tapestry of characters amongst this town. And really, for me, one of the biggest characters in this book is actually the setting. Because I think there's no way to sort of pick all these people up and take them out of this small town, put them somewhere else and get that same story. It's so tied to place.
Yeah, so the novel, it's set in a town called Kinloch, which is it's a fictional tourist town on the west coast of Ireland. It was interesting to me because I was saying earlier about the way that sometimes the most important decisions you make when writing aren't even decisions that you realize you've made. It's not like Kinloch was an object that I needed to create within the horizon of the novel. Kinloch was the horizon. Everything that came out while I was writing the book, it was arising out of this town. But the town was already there, just waiting for me to write it, I know that on some level, I was probably influenced by things like, like Derry in Stephen King's books, this creation of a place where you give yourself the imaginative, maybe even cinematic license to kind of do things in a place because you're not tied to the specifics of an actual place out there in the world. But I also remember seeing, there was a painting that I saw many years ago by Sheila, the Austrian painter, and the painting is supposed to be of Vienna. But if you know Vienna, like the painting is it's all wrong in the sense that, you know, that building is not next to that building. They're in totally different parts of town, and that place is way smaller than there, but in the picture it's way larger and stuff like that. And then what you realize is that this was the Vienna of his heart. This was all of the places that resonated most to him. He had kind of made this affective map of Vienna in this painting. And I think in many ways, Kinloch was sort of like that for me. It was, you know, it was a place that was a kind of a collage of a lot of locations, real or imagined, that I've had in my own life, places that I had certain emotional resonances to, and they kind of came together to be Kinloch. But again, like I said, I'm reasoning this in a post facto way. It's like it's there, and now I have to kind of invent a kind of reason for it, you know?
Now when everyone is asking you, how did you come up with it? You're like, now I have to come up with a reason of how I came up with it.
There's an Irish writer named Mike McCormick, and I remember seeing him being interviewed once, and the writer asked him a question about, so when you were writing that book, and he said, I have no memory of writing that book. I was writing it for 5 years and I have no memory of writing it. And I could respect his honesty in that answer, but you could also see the color just drain out of the face of the interviewer.
Right,
it's like, oh no. God, how am I going to get through the next hour if this is the kind of answer I'm going to get?
You sure you don't want to make some stuff up? Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
This is your chance.
Exactly. So I'm trying that at least, you know.
Yes, no, it's going well. It's making sense.
Okay.
But that's, I mean, I think that is always the interest, right? For everyone else is like, how did you come up with this book? And I feel like it's so much pressure to say like, oh, here are all the things that you've done. And, you know, that expectation of like, I've listened to a million other writers talk about their process and then have to put your own process out there, I imagine is a little daunting at this point.
It is daunting, and it's daunting just because I don't feel like I'm particularly articulate about it for myself. But I know that as someone who, you know, I never formally studied creative writing. So for me, a lot of my education in terms of technique and process and stuff was from listening to writers talk about their process. So listening to a lot of podcasts and kind of learning from, you know, if I liked a particular novel, I would read every interview I could get my hands on with the writer of that novel about that novel. I would listen to every interview that they had, or look up any old video on YouTube or any current video on YouTube where they talk about it, to just pick up on technique. And then of course they would recommend writers that they were influenced by, and then I would do the same with them. And that was sort of that's how I learned certain formal skills, you know, was just listening to people talk about their craft. So I think it has a real value. I just don't necessarily feel like I'm equipped to do it yet, you know.
Well, all it takes is practice, and you never know. I feel like there's so much out there that you never know when that one thing is going to click with someone else, or when that one thing is going to click with you, because writing it's such a personal and subjective thing. I mean, it's going to be different for everyone. So you never know who someone's going to listen to this and be like, exactly, that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, fingers crossed, you know. Yeah, I hope so.
One of my favorite sort of things about this book is the way that you use time. It is such a book that is sort of rooted and unrooted in time, because we're sort of bouncing back and forth constantly between this incredible summer that these kids had in their youth and their teenage years, and then we're sort of confronted with their present and the way that these years have gone by, and we have to slowly pick up these details in between, especially with some of the other characters that we don't see quite right away. Aiden and Aoife, we have to sort of put these pieces together. How did you keep all of these sort of timelines straight, and the different ways that the different characters perceive these timelines? Do you do any sort of like formal drafting or like outlining, or is it all just buzzing in there all the time?
It was definitely like always buzzing in there, but I did have to do all those classic kind of, you know, things that you see in a bad movie where someone's got the pieces of paper on the floor and they're kind of moving them around. And, you know, I mean, I'm sure that, you know, I'm sure at some point, like the wall in the room where I was writing probably looked like, the lair of some paranoid conspiracy theorist maniac with all these kind of arrows drawn between things and stuff. But I did have to think a lot about that, because I want the experience for the reader of the book, the transitions from past to present, or from one character's perspective to another. I wanted that to be incredibly fluent and just fluid, that the reader would just be kind of being taken along by this. But the actual architecture of it was so kind of very time consuming and intricate, because it's a mystery, so you have to really control the information, and the way that you're layering out bits of information is crucial to the entire structure of the book. But then you have to be true to the emotions of the characters, what they would be remembering at certain points. You have to be true to what they would be perceiving. So what Helen wouldn't notice that, or but Mush wouldn't be thinking about that because his attention would be on this. I think it actually was George R. R. Martin who once described, he said that there were gardener writers and there were architect writers, and a gardener writer was someone who would kind of, I think he was talking more about people that were doing very character-led work, where they would have an idea and then they would allow it to kind of grow in the direction that it needed to grow. And then you had the architects who would have a kind of, they would orchestrate this huge structure, and then they would implement it in the text. And in a weird way, because of the nature of the book, because it is very character-led, but it is a mystery, it is literary, but it is a thriller, I had to kind of be doing both simultaneously, and that required just a lot of back and forth. I would get to a certain point with the structural process, and then I would try to implement that, and the characters would just resist and be like, no, I'm not doing that, this isn't right. And that would mean I'd have to go back again. And it was this constant thing of, I would draw a map, and then I'd realize the territory was different, and I'd kind of go around the territory, and then I'd redraw the map, and then, just going back and forth, back and forth. There were many times where I felt like, I don't know if I can do it, like I always believed in the characters and everything like that, but it was more this thing of, I don't know if I can pull this off, so that was constantly like this thing of holding your nerve, for years,
Don't worry, you pulled it off. It seems like the book fought you a little bit to get there, but you pulled it off. It's good. It's done. Unless you still like wake up in cold sweats being like, wait, which detail was that? Who said? And then, it all comes back to you. But
yeah. I'm trying my best not to indulge in that.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe the next one will come a little easier after you did the fight on this.
That's what my agent did say to me. She was like, the structure, like the number of points of view, the size of the cast, the double timelines. She said, like, it's a first novel. Could you not have could you not have just done something a bit more straightforward? It's what you said earlier, that sometimes, it's not like you're choosing the project. The project kind of comes, and then you have to do it,
If you do the most challenging thing first, then everything that comes after will seem better.
That's a very optimistic. And I am going to definitely try to internalize that, because that's a good approach. That's what I'm going to do. Yes. Okay. I'm taking that one with me.
Something I think that is so well done and so like perfectly crafted in this book is some of the teenage nostalgia feelings that not only just the moments when you're expressing them as teenagers, but the sort of 30-year-old looking back at their teenage self, being like, what was I doing back then? And sort of managing things that were really, really important back then that somehow seem less important, or the things that were really important that sort of got minimized and sort of moved past really quickly, and balancing all those like teenage feelings, which are somehow so big at all times.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is that, on some level, because the emotional voltage of those years is so intense and so overwhelming, for almost everyone, I would say, that you would speak to, they would be, even people who hated their teenage years would never deny the intensity of those years, there's such potency to it. And in many ways, the characters as adults, they're trapped in the emotional amber of those years. There are things that happened in those teenage years that have in some way created the emotional contours of the rest of their lives. And you can see that, that emerges as the book goes on. You begin to see how in many ways the wounds that were inflicted during that time when they were teenagers together and all of these, dramatic events happened, in some way those wounds have been the emotional landscape within which they've been navigating the rest of their lives. So, I think a lot of people probably would have similar stories from their own lives. I mean, that's one of the things that's been quite interesting to me is, the book isn't out yet, but there are people who have read it because, it was sent to publishers and, things like that. And, I've heard from people like in their 20s, and I've heard from people in their 60s about, oh, this took me back, it was like, oh, I remember that. Or, and it's that thing that on some level you're always carrying that with you, I mean, part of you is always 15 years old kind of thing, for better and for worse, but like that's not something to be mourned or to be rejected. It's just something that, like in this book, it's something that you have to come to terms with in some way,
I was definitely taken back with the sort of survival skills, the ferocity, the intensity of teenage girls, and the obliviousness of teenage boys. There's so many moments where we're watching these girls just struggle to live their lives, and these boys do not know what's going on half the time.
Yeah, I like, as a former teenage boy, I can definitely claim to my fair share of obliviousness. But, it was important to me that I kind of honored the dynamics that do happen within teenage girl friendships, because there is a distinction there, at least in my own experience, there certainly was in my friend group, that's for sure.
But clearly you took the time to get to know your characters. I mean, the way you've been talking about them in this interview and the way that I think so many of us feel about characters that we read and while we're reading them is that they are people to us in those moments. We interact with them like they're real people. And that allows those moments that maybe you haven't experienced that, but because you've taken the time to understand these characters, you're able to write from that perspective. And it translates for the reader because I haven't lived the experience of Joe or Mush as well, but I really felt connected in those moments to those characters.
Oh, that's nice. That means a lot to me to hear that. Thank you.
That freedom of like biking and walking around your town and sort of traversing it in that way. I think I like that. They don't spend that much time in cars in this book. It feels like they're really spending a lot of time walking and biking and sort of navigating in that way. And they're very grounded in interacting with the character of this town.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They're definitely, on some level they're in this, obliviousness of teenage self-involvement and things like that. But on another level, they're so grounded in their world, physically even, these kind of visceral experiences are going through, whether it's even just innocent things like swimming in a lake and things like that. They are very much in their bodies, whereas you see certainly in their adult selves, there's a kind of disconnection or something, that at least when we encounter them at the beginning of the book, they are like a lot of us as adults, they're kind of a bit uprooted from whatever vital soil it was that was nourishing them back then,
When you're reading and out in your own life, are you looking for those thriller elements that come into this book? Are you reading for voice in the literary fiction space? It's very interesting to sort of mesh those two things together in the way that you do in this book, to take some of these really classic mystery and thriller elements and then at the same time have so much care for sentences and language and this structural piece. So I wonder, when you're reading in your own life outside of just writing, what you look for the most.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be primarily looking at, at voice, the language, the voice. That's kind of when I'm reading, that's really what I'm most interested in, because I often find that if you just have a strong voice, often that is as compelling as any kind of propulsive plot. I used to think of like there's a novel. The novel's called My Phantoms. Her name's Gwendolyn Riley, but the book is about the relationship between a woman and her mother. And there's a set, like if someone said to you, "What's the story of the book?" Just like, well, there isn't a story in terms of like this happens and this happens and this happens, but it is such a page turner because the voice is so vivid and the relationship is drawn so in such richness and with such intensity that you're just it's like the book just grabs you by the scruff of the neck and just pulls you through itself, you know. And I often think that if you get those elements, like if the voice and the character depth and the dynamics between characters are well drawn enough, that already generates its own momentum. I think that in terms of like the thriller dimension or the mystery dimension, I think that was more coming from my love of, you know, yeah, like certain TV shows or films, even, you know, like classic noir, but also, you know, just, you know, like most people, you know, a lot of HBO things like that, you know, like a lot of people today. But you know what I love about, let's say, for example, something like Mayor of Easttown, that was broadcast after I had already finished the book, basically. What I found very compelling about that was the fact that you had a mystery, but actually the propulsion of the story was more about the dynamics between and within the characters, as opposed to, you know, a cliffhanger every episode and things like that. It was much more about, I care about these people, I care about the emotional stakes about what's going on between these people. And that's what's actually pulling me through the story. It's not a cheap kind of gimmick of just, you know,
right.
He opened the door and couldn't believe what he saw. Yes. Next episode, you know, kind of.
Right. No, there's definitely a lot of depth. I was thinking of sort of like BBC dramas like The Fall with Gillian Anderson and Jamie Dornan. Sort of that like more expansive, you are seeing so much more of the character than maybe even the crime. And it really pulls you in that way.
Yeah, and I think then, you know, that's the thing as well, is that if you do have that level of investment in the depth and the vulnerabilities of the characters, that makes, you know, the events, the darker events, like the moments of violence or the actual crimes themselves, it makes them resonate in just a much more powerful way, because you really feel how these things ripple on and on and on and on, you know, within the individuals, but also between them and out through the generations and out through the society, etc. You get a lot more from having that kind of investment in the depth of the characters than you would if it was just bam, 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 like constant action, but no sense of stake or consequences at play.
And it really pulls everything together into this really cohesive piece. I mean, by the time I got to the end, I mean, I read this the first time a few months ago and then picked it back up right before this. And by the time you get to the end, you are both like, I can't wait for this to be done because I just need to know what happens. But at the same time, I find myself wondering, like, I hope they're all okay. Like, I hope everyone is okay at the end, because you do come to care for all the characters so much that you just hope that whatever goes on after that last page, that they come to some sort of peace.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I couldn't ask for a better response to the book, to the end of the book than that. You know, that's wonderful to hear. Thank you.
And I know we talked about this a little bit before, after you made your most ambitious foray into novel writing with this, but do you have anything coming up? Are you working on the next thing yet?
Yeah, I am. So Kala has been optioned for adaptation for TV. So I'm working with that. But there is a novel. There's another novel that I'm working on at the moment. I have a musician friend, and she once told me that she never shares work in progress because it scratches the part of her brain, like the reward part of her brain, and tricks her into thinking that she's got something done. I actually had that approach when I wrote Kala as well. There was a certain point after the first 40 pages or so where I stopped showing any of it to anyone until I finished the book. And that was really important, just as a way of keeping, it's like a pressure cooker. If you keep the lid on, then it generates enough tension within you that you have to keep going and going. So that's my very roundabout way of giving you nothing.
That's fine. I mean, I don't need to know what it is. I'm just excited that there is going to be another thing. I'll read whatever it is after this, so you don't have to worry about that.
Oh, thank
But
you.
it's very exciting to hear all those different updates. But I can't wait for people to get their hands on this book. It's going to be such a fun, wild ride for everyone to go on, with a lot of heart and a lot of character that is just going to take them to the next level. So, Colin, thank you so much for joining us today and being with us here on Poured Over. And for all of our listeners, pick up Calla as soon as you can. You won't regret it.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks, Jen.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Topoff. We're going to recommend a couple of fantastic books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Calla. I'm Marc. I'm coming to you from my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by my book buddy, Madyson. Hello, Madyson.
Hi.
I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. I am very excited for Colin Walsh's new book. It seems very like literary thriller, right up a lot of people's alley, perfect for the season, and I could not even start thinking about a recommendation without partnering with my reigning queen of thrillers, and that is Jen at the Beaver Creek store in Ohio. She and I have talked about thrillers many times. She's recommended so many books to me, and she is very stoked to read this book. So I gave her full reign to choose a title, and she came through as expected with a wonderful title called When the Stars Go Dark by Ms. Paula McLean. So McLean is usually known for her historical fiction, The Paris Wife being kind of right up there at the top for her. This one is a newer release, and it is a slow burn literary thriller. I think the way that she tackles language is really fitting for a suspense novel. So the way that she kind of braids past trauma with present suspense is really on full blast here in the best way. We follow a character named Anna. She's a missing persons detective who has just recently gone through a really terrible loss. She is essentially returning to her hometown to convalesce, to heal from something really tragic. And while she's there, a teenager girl goes missing. And this spurs on a lot of memories from Anna's childhood, and a particular case that feels eerily familiar from when she was growing up. So the way that the past and the present start to envelop Anna really gives her the realization that she is meant to solve this case. She is the person who has chosen to do this. McLean gives us a slow burn that I think also allows for a lot of fast page turning. She packs a lot of emotional heft into this. She also allows the reader to get more pieces of Anna's past uncovered as the book goes on, right up until the very last page. So the connection from her current tragedy mixed with the case that she is working on, mixed with the case that sort of haunted her childhood without her even realizing it, are all coming to a head. Each of the details of these three separate timelines are building up to something fantastic. I'm glad she recommended this one. It was sort of needling in the back of my head, and she just reaffirmed, if you want to go with literary thriller, then Paula McLean's When the Stars Go Dark is a great place to go. Madyson, what do you have for us?
Yes, I feel like my pick is also in that similar vein of like going back to kind of like your childhood and your roots in a way. And I chose a book that kind of has done some genre hopping. Some people, I think it was originally horror, then people are like, no, it's thriller. Some people have put it in fiction. But I chose Devil House by John Darnell. And I chose this one because I liked just kind of the pull of it. It takes place with Gage is our main character. He is a true crime writer. He had one huge success, one huge story that got like a movie adaptation and all these things, and like a few minor successes, but now he's kind of like stuck. So he's kind of like, how can I get this unstuck? And to do this, he is offered to spend a few nights in a house in a small town in California called the Devil House. It is a notorious house where a pair of murders occurred in the 1980s kind of during a satanic panic. And he is here to write about the crime. But what really kind of pulls it in is that him as a true crime writer, when he writes his books, it's not really just like victims, or he brings kind of like a life back to them and shows that they aren't just victims, they are people with backstories and feelings and thoughts. But as the story progresses, you kind of see him reach back into his own past, because this town is also the town where his childhood friend lived. So you also get that connection of how this place is starting to mean something to him. And I feel like if you're a fan of true crime, this is another book that's really, really meant for you. It explores not only the writer, but also the crimes itself. So it kind of pulls that fiction along with the true crime in and kind of just makes a very intriguing tale, which also kind of helps you see why it can fit into so many types of genres, because it's kind of a mixed bowl. It has a little bit of that scary, it has a little bit of that thrill, and then at its core, it also has that fiction that like pulls you back in to the main character, and it all is interwoven and connected. Him go on his own journey as well as he remembers this childhood friend, which is why I chose Devil House by John Darnielle.
I love that book. I love that book. I love John Darnielle. He's one of the coolest humans in general. Please, if you get a chance, listen to the poured over episode for Devil House when it first was released in hardcover. Nice choice. But that is all we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over, and please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester.
And I'm Madyson. You can follow my home store at BN Events Grove.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.